but I think we'll get started. So thanks so much for joining us today for the first episode of our Connectivity Matters series. So we put this together as a series of discussions and hopefully field excursions for the purpose of sharing knowledge about ecological connectivity and to help build capacity for biodiversity conservation in our region. The series is part of our wildlife connectivity project, and most of you are familiar with the project, so I won't go into a lot of detail on it today. But as you know, it's a multi-year collaborative project that's being led by the Squamish Environment Society, the Howe Sound Biosphere Region Initiative Society, and by a coalition of local, regional, and provincial organizations who all share a mandate for biodiversity conservation in this area. For those who don't know me, my name is Murray Chernay, and I'll be the host for today and also for the series. I'm one of the directors with the Squamish Environment Society, also known as Nature Squamish. We're a community-based volunteer organization. We've been working in the Upper Howe Sound region since 1982. We're a registered charity and a federated member of BC Nature. And our mission is to do what we're doing here today, is to seek understanding about the natural environment and to share that knowledge with others who are in a position to take actions to promote biodiversity conservation in our area. This project provides a great opportunity to learn about this land through both Indigenous knowledge perspectives and also Western science. And it's one of the cool things about this project. We're just getting started, but we're mindful that these lands have sustained the Coast Salish peoples since the retreat of glaciers from here almost 10,000 years ago. Kind of mind-boggling that there is a record of, over that period of time, there's a record of active mountain building and the shifts in climate that have occurred over that period of time. And the insights and knowledge gained through this process are embedded in principles of resilience and practices of environmental stewardship that have been carried forward to this day by the Squamish Nation. And we're grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with them and learn from members of the Squamish Nation to advance shared goals for biodiversity conservation. Using the chat feature, I'm going to ask you to use that throughout the presentation, but right now I'm going to ask you to take a moment to just introduce yourself. I think we know most everybody here, but there may be a few folks you don't know. And just take a moment to share your name and either the organization or the region that you represent. And if you're willing, please also share the name of an animal that you most identify with today. It might be an animal whose characteristics you admire, or it could be a threatened species whose future you're concerned about. So just let us know who's on your mind today. And while you're doing that, well, you know what? I was going to give a brief overview of the project, but given that we all kind of have a pretty good idea of what the project is, either as a steering committee member or as a technical working group member, I think you've had some background information. But I will say that based on the feedback we received from many of you last fall during the initial design phase of our project, we've been working in the background on a hybrid approach to assessing patterns of wildlife connectivity. One that blends regional species distribution models that are currently available for wide-ranging carnivores and ungulates with more localized models of habitat use for smaller mammals and herpetofauna, which are used to highlight patterns of connectivity at scales that are relevant to conservation planning decisions at a more local or site level. Our presentation today is by Kate Andy. Great that you're here. I was getting worried, but there you are. No, I wasn't. We joined a bit early, compare notes. Anyway, Kate's an applied wildlife ecologist who recently graduated with a Master of Resource Management degree from Simon Fraser University. And as part of Kate's thesis, she carried out field-based research using camera traps to assess habitat use of riparian corridors by mammals in the Squamish Valley and also in the Maple Ridge area of Metro Vancouver. And the insights and knowledge gained through this work have helped to inform ongoing investigations that Kate's leading on behalf of the Squamish Environment Society and our project. Um, Kate's going to provide an overview of local species distribution models that she's been working on over the last few months, and a sneak preview of some of our initial study results. And I know she's eager for your input and feedback on overall approach and methodology as we continue to develop and refine these models over the coming months. To that end, we really encourage you to share your comments and questions in the chat session. While Kate's giving her presentation, we'll be monitoring that and we'll bring those questions back for a discussion at the end. We'll have about 35, 40 minutes for the presentation and time at the end for lots of questions and kind of thinking collectively about what comes next. So with that, it's my pleasure to pass the baton over to Kate. And while she's getting her presentation started, I'll just invite you to take a moment to make sure your microphone is muted for the presentation. Be comfortable, be nourished, and we're really looking forward to having this opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into the work that Kate's doing. So I'll pass it over to you, Kate.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Murray, for the introduction. I'll just go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking your lunch break to join us in this webinar today. As Murray introduced, my name is Kate Andy, and I've been working with the Wildlife Connectivity Project team to lead the development of local species distribution models. I've been largely working behind the scenes while developing these models, but today I'd like to open up the doors and share sort of all the details that I've been working on up to this point. So I'll first discuss the process of modeling habitat suitability at a local scale. And then I'll share some preliminary results of habitat suitability for a few focal species in our study area. Reminder that these are just preliminary results. There's still lots of work to do. And so that's why we're having this initial webinar today, is to sort of gauge and receive some feedback on your end. And then, so this is sort of brings us to the rest of the webinar, where we can open up a discussion and share feedback on anything you'll see today. It's also an opportunity for you to ask me any questions that you might have. And then I'm also seeking some answers to some questions that I provided in the supplementary materials section of our webinar site. And if you have any suggestions or answers to those questions, if you looked at these materials ahead of time, our discussion today is a great time to bring that up. Okay, so if there's not any initial questions, we can go ahead and dive into our species distribution modeling. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the modeling process, let's sort of situate ourselves into the problem wildlife are facing. It's no surprise that our landscapes are changing at astounding rates. The compounding effects of climate change and human development are making it increasingly challenging for wildlife to find suitable habitat to survive and reproduce. Development is only going to increase with time, as will our natural disasters and climate warming. So the motivation for the Wildlife Connectivity Project is to really safeguard pathways of ecological connectivity in a changing landscape. So in this world, wildlife can find enough suitable habitat to survive no matter the changes occurring on the landscape. So our goal here is to protect biodiversity. In order to create these pathways of ecological connectivity, we need to understand what is suitable habitat for wildlife. Our partners at Terradapt have done a great job developing habitat suitability maps for a few umbrella species in the Cascadia region. When we look at habitat suitability at a regional scale, we can really see these networks of connectivity between specific areas that are highly suitable for a focal species. In the map on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the habitat suitability at a regional scale. So you can see these areas of light green showing higher habitat suitability. And I should mention this is habitat suitability for a grizzly bear. So the lighter green areas are showing higher habitat suitability in contrast with the darker purple areas. And if you link together these lighter green areas, then you can see an ecological connectivity network forming in the region. So the regional scale is great at identifying these ecological connectivity networks, but we heard feedback from you all that it can be difficult to manage land at a local scale when the reference for management is at a large regional scale. So the work I'm doing is attempting to integrate the regional habitat suitability modeling down to the local scale. The figure on the right-hand side illustrates my point. The whole image represents a regional scale in which we could create an ecological connectivity network across the region. But if you were to take a magnifying glass and hover over a focal area, perhaps an area of interest for you, you could tease apart the same patterns and you'd start to see an image like what's on the left-hand side of your screen. You'd have core areas of habitat that are ideal for a species or perhaps several species, and you could link them together to allow for connectivity between these larger swaths of suitable habitat. These connections are called corridors, and they come in many forms. They could be continuous strips of habitat, stepping stone connections, or even the riparian habitat beside streams. But essentially, while working at a local scale, you can connect habitat core areas, and these connections and links to core areas will scale up to a regional level, which will give us the clear ecological connectivity network for the entire region. And so this brings me to the goal of the work that I'm leading. And this is essentially to use species distribution models. So to produce maps very similar to the one you saw from TerraDapt, showing habitat suitability. So we'll use species distribution models to understand how wildlife are using local habitat parcels. So we're scaling down from the regional level to the local level. So we're understanding how wildlife are using local habitat parcels in the face of changing environmental conditions within the Alcaltsam-Howsound UNESCO Biosphere region and surrounding areas of the Sea to Sky Corridor in Southwest British Columbia. So what is a species distribution model? Essentially, we are hoping to model the probability of occurrence for a focal species in a given study area. The probability of occurrence is how likely it is for a species to be using a particular part of a study area. And for the purposes of our work, we can think of probability of occurrence as a proxy for habitat suitability, because the more likely it is for a species to be found in an area, it can be assumed that that area is likely more suitable for a species. So we'll first be modeling, we'll be first running a species distribution models off of our large, wide-ranging mammals. And the reason why we'll do that is because they'll create images much like the figure that you see before you on the slide. And you can kind of see it projected out into our study area, which is outlined in red in the upper right-hand corner. So when we model for these large, wide-ranging mammals, we'll pull apart our habitat core areas, which are these nodes in the figure here. And then you can actually see the branches connecting these nodes, and these might be useful movement corridors or actually important residential habitat in and itself. So when we model the large, wide-ranging species, we'll get our clear ecological connectivity networks. However, we can't forget about the species that might be very small. They maybe have specific habitat requirements, or maybe they only exist in certain parts of our study area. So we'll model habitat suitability for these species as well. And these will pull out critical habitat parcels that we can't forget to include in our ecological connectivity networks. So our goal here is to try to incorporate all species into our models as we create ecological connectivity networks, but the role that they serve in our final output will differ by species. So how do we build a species distribution model? Well, the first piece that we need is to assemble or accumulate occurrence observations of a particular focal species. And so this would be where in our study area did we either observe or didn't observe a particular species. Right now, we have access to two sources of data. We have the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, so known as GBIF, and this has several sources of data built into it. So it encompasses iNaturalist observations, so a community science platform. It also has preserved museum specimen, material genetic samples, and more. And this data comes as presence-only data. So this would be where in the landscape we actually observed a particular focal species. We also have access to a camera trap survey that I conducted for my master's thesis at Simon Fraser University with Dr. Chelsea Little. And this camera trap survey was done in the Squamish area and the Maple Ridge area. And with this data, we have presence absence data. So this would be for each camera trap site, we either have an observed or confirmed presence of a particular species or not, which would be an absence. This is a list of species of mammals and herpetofauna that we're building our initial species distribution models off of. We're hoping to expand this list, but this is just what we're working with for our preliminary results for now. We decided this list based on feedback from you all on what you considered to be important species to model for our study area. This list was further refined to those species that had enough observations to run a successful model. So if the first ingredient to a species distribution model is the wildlife occurrence data, the second ingredient would be the environmental variables. So these would be variables that describe the characteristics of the environment or conditions of the environment and help us set up that gradient of what is suitable versus less suitable for a particular species. So I provided a list of variables that we're working with at the moment. And these variables come from the regional biodiversity assessment from Terradapt and also publicly available data from the province. And so you can see, again, we're trying to nest the regional and local scales. We're applying local data to local wildlife occurrence data to regional environmental layers. So we have our wildlife occurrence data, we have our environmental predictor variables. The last decision we need to make is the type of species distribution model that we'll run. And this decision comes down to what sources of data we have available to us. So if we only have one source of data available to us, say we just have the GBIF data or iNaturalist observations, then we will run a species distribution model, just a regular species distribution model. And this is the species highlighted in yellow are the species that we'll need to run, at least for now, a regular species distribution model on. So we only have GBIF data for the species highlighted in yellow. The ones highlighted in blue, we have two sources of data available to use. And so when we have multiple data sources, so in this case, when we have the GBIF and the camera trap survey, we can pool together these two different models and run what's called an integrated species distribution model. And I'll get into this next. So why would we run an integrated species distribution model or an ISDM? Well, first we can pool together heterogeneous data sources. So we can use multiple different sources of data and combine them all into one model. And this is really great because we can pool the strengths of different model types and incorporate them into one final outcome. We might also, when we pool together this data, we might actually also get a more representative data source throughout our study area. So we might have more data to work with in this case. This particular model, it models for the probability of occurrence, if you remember, which is how likely it is for a species to be found in a particular area. But this particular model also allows us to account for detection probability. And so this would be how likely it is for a species to actually be observed in a particular area. And so if you remember, some of the data that's being fed into our model is human collected or human survey data. And so that might be particularly biased by things like how close the observation was to a trail network or a city center. And so you might have more observations closer to biased areas, if you will. And so this particular model allows us to model for the probability of occurrence while addressing biases of detection. This model also lets us address things like imperfect detection and repeat visits. And this particularly comes into play for the camera trap portion of the model, so our occupancy modeling. Okay, so now these next couple of slides, I will take us through the process of an integrated species distribution model. For the purposes of this presentation, I won't have time today to go through what is the process of a SDM or a species distribution model. But just know that the process of an ISDM versus an SDM are very similar. It's just mostly the main difference is the integrated species distribution model runs multiple data sources together, whereas the regular species distribution model is just working with one data source. If you're curious about the process of an SDM or want more detail about the ISDM, there is a detailed methods section written out and shared with you all on the webinar site. And also, if you're curious, you can look at my code. I've uploaded that as well. So we'll go over a high-level process of the ISDM, and then we'll dive into some of the more nitty-gritty details, but I will pull us all together towards the end and show you some preliminary results. Okay, so the first step of an ISDM is to pull together our our wildlife occurrence data. So we're going to collect our GBIF observations and our camera trap observations of a particular species of interest. Then we're going to pull together our environmental predictor variables. So again, these describe the conditions of the environment. Here's the same list I shared with you earlier in the presentation. So we'll pull together the variables. We'll pull together the variables that we would like to work with in our model. And we will actually plot our occurrence observations on top of those environmental predictor variables. So now we can see what were the conditions what were the environmental conditions where we either observed or didn't observe a particular species. And this allows us to set up our gradient of what is considered to be suitable versus less suitable habitat. And so with that understanding, we can kind of predict out this relationship for the rest of the study area, and this would produce our map, which shows the probability of occurrence, or our habitat suitability map. Okay. Now, for our sort of more technical audience, we can dip into the specific methods of the ISDM. So we need to do a little bit of data preparation before we can input them into the model. And so we need to clean up our data a little. With the GBIF data, we will first subset that data set to just keep research grade iNaturalist observations. We will keep records from the year 1985 onwards. We will bound the data within our study area, so remove any data outside of our area of interest. And we will also remove data that have either very low locational precision or overly accurate locational precision. To the camera trap data, we will just essentially keep the photo data combined to independent detections. And this helps limit a bias of the same individual lingering in front of the camera again and again. And lastly, we will subset both data sets to just our focal species. This particular model can't handle entire communities or several species at once. And so we'll just be working one species at a time. So after we've prepared our wildlife occurrence data, we can prepare our environmental predictor variables. These come in the form of raster layers, so map layers, and we want to be able to sort of overlay them on top of each other. So we need to standardize them. So they'll all be fitted together. The values will be scaled so they're comparable. And we're keeping a very fine 30 by 30 meter resolution. And that's so that we can project results out to a scale that is useful for you as our project partners. We're using predictive modeling here. So we're trying to incorporate as many variables as we can that aren't highly correlated. So we do test for collinearity, and we're using a threshold of 0.6 here. To help with our variable selection in the event that there were collinear variables, we generated a list of variables that we thought would be impactful on the occurrence of a particular species. And we did that for every species. We made a unique list for every species that we modeled. And in the event that there were correlated variables, we relied on that list to help us make our final selection. The last part of preparing the environmental predictor variables was to split these variables into occupancy and detection groupings. So variables which influence the occupancy would influence whether or not a species would use a particular area. And variables which influence detection would influence how likely an occurrence observation would happen. Okay, so once we prepare the data, now we can transform them into the form that they need to go into our model. And so right now, our wildlife occurrence data is in what we'll call geographic space. So they each have, each data point has a latitude and a longitude associated with it. You can plot it in space. You'll see them right on the map here. You can see our GBIF data plotted in our study area. But what we need to do is translate them into what we'll call environmental space. So we need to understand, instead of where they are located, we need to understand what are the environmental conditions in that area in order to see what is considered suitable or unsuitable for a species. And so since we have our occupancy and detection groupings, we will essentially transform our occurrence observations into occupancy and detection values. So with our GBIF data, we will assign values for our occupancy layers, our environmental layers describing the occupancy, to each occurrence observation. And we'll do the same for our detection layer. So we'll assign values for detection layers to each occurrence observation. So we're taking it from geographic space, translating it into environmental space. Our GBIF data comes in as presence-only data, if you remember. So again, just describing where we saw a particular species, but not where we didn't. And so with this particular type of data, we need to incorporate what's called background data. And these serve as pseudo-absence data in a presence-only data set. So we need to, where everywhere else that we didn't see an observation or a particular species, we need to put a point in space. And so again, that's a point in geographic space, but we need to translate that to our environmental space. So we transform it from a point into sort of a grid, if you will, a raster grid. And once again, we assign the values for our occupancy layer to each cell in our raster grid. And we do the same for our detection layers, assign values for detection layers to each raster cell. So now with our GBIF data, we have environmental information on where we saw a species and where we didn't see a species. We do almost the same thing with our camera trap data. The camera trap data is in geographic space. We have locations for each camera. We need to see what the environmental conditions were like at each camera. So we assign values for occupancy layers to each camera trap location to make our occupancy matrix. The detection matrix is done a little bit differently because there is a different detection bias with camera trapping versus human surveying. So the camera trap is biased by how open or visible the view shed is in front of each camera by season. And so that was information that I collected during a fieldwork season. During the fieldwork seasons I had done for my master's. And so that information I was able to just upload right into this model. Lastly, the camera trap data requires a presence-absence matrix for camera trap locations by season. So the ones in this matrix describe a presence of a particular species at a site in a given season, whereas a 0 represents an absence of that particular species. Okay, so with all of that data set, now we have everything translated into environmental space. Now we can put all of that into our model. So we ran a 5-fold cross-validation, and we used the PBSO integrated function from the paper Koshkina et al., and that's whose code I'm sort of mimicking or using as a reference throughout this ISDM modeling process. So with a 5-fold cross-validation, we run the model 5 different times. And in each time, we have a grouping of 80% of the data, which is reserved for running through the model function, and 20% of the data is reserved for evaluating the performance of the model at the end. And every iteration that we run this model, so we do it a total of 5 times, every iteration, we have a different grouping of training and testing data. So when we get our results, we can test our model performance by passing our testing data set through our model results and generating what's called an ROC curve for every model iteration. We can average the area under that curve and get an AUC value, which is in this case, our metric of model performance. So the higher the AUC value, the better the model performance, if you will. With the rest of the results, we can average those results, and then we can work on visualizing our ISDM. So our model outputs beta values for every single environmental variable that we put into our model. And we can calculate the relationship between those average beta values from our model outputs and the values of our environmental layers. Shown in this equation in the topmost box here, and we'll get what's called our intensity layer. And this is the expected density of individuals per unit area. We can transform that layer into a relative abundance, which is roughly the number of individuals in a given unit of area. And then we can, again, further extrapolate that and get the probability of occurrence. And so that would be the figure shown in the lower right-hand corner there. That's kind of our ultimate outcome for the purposes of this work. And again, the probability of occurrence, how likely it is for a species to be using a particular area. Okay, so that was the methodology. I hope to bring us all back together now for some preliminary results. And I will walk us through a couple of different species that I have some preliminary results for, but I wanted to first show you, so this is our black bear example. I wanted to first show you what is like our most zoomed out version of our results. So this is the Regional Biodiversity Assessment Area. This is as like most zoomed out as I will model for my work. The scale bars in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that the orange and red values are showing our highest or most suitable habitat, so highest probability of occurrence for black bear. And when it's at this very zoomed out lens, you can really see, if you were to link together and connect these, yellow to red strips, that you could build out the ecological connectivity network throughout this study area. Here is the data distribution on the right, the figure on the right-hand side. The yellow observations are our GBIF data. The red observations are the camera trap data. And our model performance metric is in the bottom left-hand corner. So hopefully at this regional lens, you can start to see the ecological connectivity networks forming. But again, this might not be as meaningful for you if you work at a more zoomed in focal area. And so I just wanted to show you as an example, let's zoom in on an area of focus to see if we can see sort of the same patterns. So here is, again, black bear ISDM, just zoomed in a little bit more. And you can still see these patterns, our ecological connectivity network branching throughout this focal area, the red being more suitable habitat. To situate ourselves in space, the white area at the center and bottom of your screen is the Mouth of the Howe Sound, and that's where our Squamish is located. If you were to move your eyes northward, you would see the other sort of white circular area is Garibaldi Lake. So that's sort of the extent that we're looking at here. I'll pan through a few other species here so that you can compare their suitability. And as I go through the slides, the species will change, the maps will look a little different, but the image that you're looking at is ultimately the same. So it's the same focal area. So here we saw black bear. This is our coyote model. Again, the distribution of our data is in the upper right-hand corner for this particular species. Scale bar upper left, and our model performance metric in the bottom left. This is our black-tailed deer. So just give everybody a minute to make some mental comparisons. This is our bobcat model. And this is our snowshoe hare model. So these were this is just a few preliminary maps of our ISDM models. I can show one SDM model. Remember, the only difference between the ISDM and the SDM for our purposes is the data sources. So here is the painted turtle. We are relying on the GBIF data source for this model. The brighter green colors, again, it's the same. It's the same scale coloration. So in this case, the brighter green colors are showing more suitable habitat. Okay, so hopefully this gives you an idea of kind of what I've been working on and what these models can start to tell us. I did just want to bring up two important limitations that I've run into so far with this modeling process. So here's our list of initial species that we want to work with. The ones highlighted in yellow are the species I just showed you preliminary maps for. The observation columns, that's the number of observations we were given from GBIF originally. But if you remember, I went through and I cleaned up that data quite a bit and kept just our best records. And after I did that, this is actually what we're working with in the models. So it's cut down quite a bit. And for species like, the painted turtle, bobcat, and snowshoe hare, these are quite few observations. And so I'd just like to sort of put out a call to action here. Our model accuracy will improve when we have more data points. So if you have iNaturalist observations that you'd be willing to upload, or if you know of different data sources that we could access, be very open to that conversation. And it's something that we're actively looking for to improve the model. The other limitation is the distribution of our data. So for species like coyote or black-tailed deer, we have quite a few observations, but they are sort of clustered around the southern portion of our study area. And so the information on our maps shows the probability of occurrence based on where the species was seen. So the more suitable areas are suitable for the species, but the less suitable areas might not actually be that unsuitable in areas where no monitoring has occurred. So once again, I just would like to put out a call to action. If you saw areas that were under-surveyed on any of these maps, and you're interested in launching projects in those areas to see, what species are using those areas, that would be a huge plus for us and the model. So that's something that we're looking for as well. But now to kind of get to the applied side of things, how can we use this, the outputs of these models? And so what I hope that they can be is an important guide for building out ecological connectivity networks and identifying critical local habitat parcels. So you can see the map on the right-hand side is an overlay of the painted turtle SDM and the black bear ISDM. And so underneath, sort of that lighter color underneath would be the ecological connectivity network built primarily by our black bear, which is a sort of larger, more of like an umbrella species. And so we would look to the black bear to help us build out our ecological connectivity networks. But we see these, they might be, you know, ponds or eddies in streams or things like that that might be very valuable for the painted turtle, for example. We wouldn't want to forget about that and exclude it from our ecological connectivity network. So we might want to prioritize pathways that include those areas that of interest for smaller, less mobile species. This modeling is sort of multi-scale. So the original, sort of the first result slide that I showed you was our most zoomed out lens, and that was the regional biodiversity assessment area. And it can show habitat suitability at that most zoomed out scale, but you can zoom into whatever area of interest matters to you. And you can begin to see these patterns emerging of habitat suitability within your jurisdictions. And so hopefully this can be a guide for you to manage within your area of focus based on trends we're seeing at a regional and local scale. And lastly, sort of in theme with everything that's been going on with the Wildlife Connectivity Project, this process is very much iterative and adaptive. So as we get new data sources, as we get better environmental predictor variables or more updated information, we can rerun these models. As we incorporate feedback from you all, again, we can rerun these models and get information that is sort of timely, accurate, and improving as we go. And sort of before I conclude today, I just wanted to leave you all with a statement saying that, you know, this model is a guide. And while we hope it's informative, it really does work best when coupled with the confirmation of wildlife presence. So we're not trying to rely solely on the information from the model, but we're incorporating the knowledge that you all have of either where you live or what you've seen on places that you've been to. And so all of that information can help improve the accuracy of our model. So we really do rely on you as our project partners throughout this process. And so before we dive into our discussion, I did just want to take a moment to thank you all for your time, not only for you know, listening to this presentation today and allowing me to explain the work that I've been doing for the past few months, but for your patience for allowing me to work on this in the background as we've been developing these models. And we thank you for your trust in this process and your continued partnership. So I really am eager to hear your feedback and answer any questions that you might have. So maybe I will turn it back over to Murray to help sort of facilitate a discussion. I'll leave this slide up for now in case it helps sort of spur conversation. These are the questions that I have about the model so far. But this by no means has to be the dominating part of the conversation. I'll hear any feedback that you might have or answer any questions that you might have. And I have provided my email in the bottom corner here in case anything comes up after our conversation today. Okay, so with all that information, thanks again for your time. And yeah, Murray, if there's any questions in the chat, I'm happy to take them.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Awesome presentation, really clear description of the work you're doing, and really an important contribution to our conversation. So thanks so much for that, and thank you everyone for starting the discussion with some questions. We have a couple, and I'll get started with some questions from Brian Stewart. Brian's with Conservation Northwest and a collaborator on this project, and has done a ton of related work down in Washington as part of the Washington Connectivity Working Group. And so Brian has a couple of questions here, and I'll just do them kind of one at a time, Kate, if you don't have the chat in front of you. So the first one is, how have you dealt with the fact that you only get presence data to where a species can go, not where they want to be?
Okay, so where we only get presence data where a species can go and not where they want to be. I wonder if this is sort of addressing a point of like a niche limitation, if you will. And
I
yeah,
can
oh yeah,
I
go
can
ahead.
clarify if it's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you imagine a grid and there's a block on this grid, and that grid is totally fragmented and species cannot access it, but it's actually their preferred habitat, and you're collecting data there, what you're going to say is, oh, this habitat isn't really where they're going to be. They don't prefer it. And so you lose the potential or possibility of a species actually wanting to access that habitat, but they can't. Thus, you may really devalue the habitat they want to be in because you're recording the habitat where they are as being preferred, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. I think I was trying to speak to that a little bit in terms of the model limitation slides that I provided. And I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, we would essentially be saying what is less suitable in an area isn't necessarily the case if we just haven't studied it enough. And so, yeah, so I think where we have data, it's saying, the habitat is suitable, and then we'll find other areas throughout the rest of the study area that is very similar to where we have data. But yeah, this is where we rely on the project partners and those of us that want to launch new projects in areas that are understudied. We really do need to access more of the study area to get a better idea of what is suitable. Does that answer your question a bit, or am I missing pieces?
To some degree, it's a question all these sort of models have struggled with to answer, simply because we rely so much on where we've collected the data. Even if you have access and you put cameras up, if a species can't access that parcel or that block of area simply because of a freeway or a development, then what you'll have is, again, like, this habitat's not that great. We have no presence here. When in fact it's the best habitat, they just can't access it. So I don't really think it can be addressed, but it's just sort of something that you have to consider when you do these types of non sort of expert led hypothetical models.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. And I'm going to write that point down. I think that's a great thing to explore a little more. I know we do have one of our environmental predictor layers is what I call connectivity, habitat connectivity. And it's essentially like a structural connectivity layer that I think looks at how easily it would be to access a particular area. And it could be limited by elevational differences and other pieces. So perhaps that's a more critical layer than, maybe that should be included in more models than I have initially. But yeah, thank you very much for that idea and question. I'm gonna do some more reading about that.
Brian, thanks so much for that question. Why don't you go ahead with your second question, and I'll just invite others when I call on you. Just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question, so it's a little bit easier to communicate what you're meaning for Kate. So Brian, go ahead with your second question.
Okay. The second one is, I think 3 of your species were fairly generalist in nature, can use a lot of habitat types. How does that help represent an ecological sort of, how does that paint the picture of all the different ecosystems within the study area if we're heavily relying on generalists?
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing I didn't mention was that these were just the species that I started working on to get some preliminary results. I do 100% understand that the maps that I've created do not represent a spread of what is a proper ecological communities within our study area. So we hope to make more models that represent the different functional groups that are present in our study area or and whatnot. But yeah, right now I was working on sort of more generalist species that we have lots of data on, and that is good information to know kind of as like an umbrella species to start with, but we will get more, we will run models for more species as we improve these models. And what they will tell us, hopefully, is either important habitat types, specific habitat parcels, or sections of the study area that are we shouldn't neglect as we're building out our ecological connectivity networks. So more work to come on that.
Great. The
Thanks.
next one is painted turtle, for example. We modeled a Western toad, or attempted to do it. And the issue we had was we would show the resolution at 30 meters, but the dispersal range of the species was so small and limited that it almost seemed like it was distorting, our results. So I'm wondering if you dealt with that or thought about, representing everything at the same pixel, but some of those species, barely exist within, even a half of the pixel, depending on the dispersal.
Yeah, that's actually something that someone brought up to me very recently, was thinking about ranges of movement. And that's something that I haven't, unfortunately, had a lot of time to think about. I would be very open to hearing how your work has been going with the Western toad. Perhaps we could email on the side after this,
Yeah.
if you don't mind.
No, totally. And then the next question is real quick. Do you plan to overlay everything when you're done to get a real ecological corridor sort of high level view, and get sort of a composite of where everything aligns? Is that the ultimate goal?
Yeah, that is the ultimate goal. That is one of the questions that I do have, is open to suggestions about how to go about doing that. So I definitely come from more of a, like, the modeling side of things, but the spatial side of things I'm newer at. So I would very much appreciate any feedback that you have from any experiences that you have with this type of work. So the goal is eventually to try to pull together, like, make our own communities from these maps. But how we're going to do that yet is sort of still in the air.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll go on to Megan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go ahead, Megan.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I'm gonna have to duck out real quick here, but I'll try to keep this brief, and apologies if I can't totally convey. I'm thank you so much for this. I think it's really interesting information. I'm on board with Brian and my concerns about models and how absence data is integrated into the model because, and particularly in the type of landscape that we're talking about in the sea to sky corridor, that's very rugged. Lots of areas that are quite inaccessible in terms of collecting information on wildlife. Absence data does not mean the species is absent. So cautioning again that probability of occurrence, to my mind, doesn't indicate habitat suitability. It's informed mostly by where people are. But what I'm wondering about is whether there is any opportunity to use this information as a launching point to then assess habitat and use look at key habitat variables that could then be plugged into a mapping exercise of where species are likely to be based on habitat, which is how things like ungulate winter range are identified, and then use that other tools like LiDAR to try to get a fuller picture of what is available in your region. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think the goal of the work that we're doing is really, at the end of the day, to just try to contribute a resource that could be useful for all of you as our partners in whatever capacity is helpful or going to be useful for you. So if it's a starting point for some additional research or additional programming, then that would be great. So what we hope is that this is just while we hope that this will guide where we see suitable habitat for a particular species, we also want this to be sort of a resource that you can use to help you manage land within your jurisdiction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what I might add to that before going to the next question is this is important, key piece of our project. And also in the background, we're working on fairly detailed terrestrial ecosystem models, more from the characteristics of those ecosystems and where they're distributed. So the work that Kate's doing is giving us some insight on those ecosystem types. And we know from other sources of information where those are distributed elsewhere in the region. And so ultimately, we're bringing these threads of insights together to take more of an ecosystem-based approach that is, complementary to the work that's been done at the provincial scale on habitat suitability and capacity ratings, for example. So it's a piece of the puzzle. It's an important piece of the puzzle. I don't want to leave anybody out here. We have just a few minutes left, and I'll go over to Cole.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I was double booked, so I missed a bit. So maybe I should just follow up with Kate separately because I have some questions that may have actually been covered during the part that I missed. But yeah, so are you ending at 1? Is that
we can stay on a little bit after, Cole. If there are questions, we will let everyone go at 1. But if you please feel free to ask it now if you want. Or
no, it's fine. I'll let others who were here the whole time ask their questions, and I'll follow up with Kate. Yeah, thank you.
Sarah, do you want to go ahead? Greg, I passed over you, but we'll get back to your question in a minute. Sarah, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think I know the answer to this question from the presentation, but I just thought I'd ask anyways. Like, if individual species are using different habitat types for different parts of their life cycle or needs, like their feeding habitat is different than their, where they need to go and hide from predators, or their denning habitats. Is that, and that's, so it's sort of like different habitat needs within the same species. Is the sort of the way the data is that sort of all integrated into the models based on, I guess, the observances, if they're sort of averaged out, assuming that you're seeing them in a variety of their different habitat types.
Yeah.
Or is that somehow addressed in here?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I've started thinking about recently. Right now, that concern is not addressed. We have just pulled together all of the observations across time, within the course of a year, and just pulled them all together and put them in. So we probably, I think if we had more data, depending on the species and what we have data available to us, we probably could break things up either seasonally or within the cycle of thinking more ecologically, instead of a calendar year, thinking in terms of an ecological year. So yes, that would be sort of like future improvements on the model, which we haven't done at the moment, but I'm going to write that point down. So thank you very much for that.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Well, I mean, it looks like it's a great base anyways. You have to, yeah. So
Appreciate it. Thanks.
I will take this opportunity. I see we have a couple hands up, and I'm going to get to both Andrea and Elise in just a second, but For those who have to go, I just want to thank you for taking the time with us today, and just to let you know that this is just the first in a series of discussions and field trips that we will be organizing over the coming year and a half or 2 years of this project. So if you are interested in sharing a piece of the puzzle, either work that you're doing, or you know of someone who you think could present work that's relevant to what we're doing here, please do reach out to us. And we will be following up with you, over the coming months to let you know of upcoming events. So thanks so much for that. And so for those who have to go, we'll catch you down the road. And with that, I'll pass over to Elise and then Andrea.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation, Kate. It's really interesting. I just had a question around how or if local Indigenous knowledge is being incorporated into the study or into the modeling that you are pursuing.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I should just start by saying that the work that I'm doing really is focused in a Western way of knowing. And so we're forming a partnership, or have formed a partnership with the Squamish Nation, and they are pursuing goals of we have a sort of similar outcome in mind of identifying, critical ecological connectivity networks, for a lack of a better term, and critical habitat for wildlife. And so we are eager to kind of work together on that, but we're not planning to, I'm not planning to integrate that work into this work by any means. We're sort of working in tandem, and comparing ways of knowing. And so that will be sort of coming in the future. But this work that I'm doing is centered in my Western way of knowing.
Elise, thanks for that question. And the only thing I would add to that is there has been quite a lot of work done by Squamish Nation members in support of their Kaitamewa sacred land use plan, and there's a huge body of knowledge and expertise around both sacred sites, sacred areas from a habitat point of view, but also knowledge about both historic and current movement patterns for wildlife species of concern. And so there is a tremendous body of knowledge there. And as Kate said, we're so grateful for the opportunity to be collaborating with the Squamish Nation on this project, and we hope to share insights, from both of our approaches in the coming years of the project. But it is one of the key goals of their Kaitamewa land use plan is this ecological connectivity piece. So it is certainly a common goal between both sides.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Elise. Andrea?
Hey, yeah, thanks. That was a fantastic presentation, Kate, and good work. I was wondering if there were any predictor variables that you found to be dominant in this modeling process, especially thinking about managing the landscape. Are there certain predictor variables that went into it that we really need to be thinking about moving forward from here to make sure that the landscape is able to support connectivity?
Yeah, that's a great question. At least from my preliminary models, I can say that the proximity to fish-bearing stream is a really important one that kind of comes up again and again for us in these models. And then elevation, I think, would be another one, of some kind. Elevation's a really complex one, kind of captures a lot of different variables as well. And let me see, I wonder if I can, just want to see which variables we have coming in here.
So you were looking at different types of streams, and you had ones where there might be fish passage that would be available, and then others that. Okay.
Yeah. Some kind of vegetation cover, like the either, it's usually either the NDVI or the canopy cover tends to be usually in these models. But yeah, and then I guess also I would also say the riparian area, the proximity to riparian areas. That's, fish-bearing stream and riparian areas are a bit related. But yeah, riparian areas are as we're understanding, becoming more and more important, especially as the rest of the landscape, outside of riparian areas are changing so rapidly. So yeah, those would be my initial suggestions for key variables.
Thanks. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If I can ask a follow-up question, I was also wondering if there were specific places that, if you've gotten to actually look through the results, were there specific places that came to mind as either being surprising or being like obvious places that really need to be focused on as being important areas to maintain connectivity to?
Yeah, maybe Murray can chime in with this too, because he's also looked at some, overlaid some human development already in place. But just from the focal area that we were looking at, if I can come back to a map here, it seems like in and around the estuary is like very there's a lot of activity happening, and so maybe it's an undervalued in terms of all the development kind of coming in and around that area. I'm not a Squamish resident, so maybe Murray, you could provide your 2 cents with that area as well. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just that it relates to one of the points that Cole raised. He had to pop off, but in the chat there, so to answer your question directly, yeah, there are some really interesting connections across the valley bottom, even in populated areas that we're picking up through this work. Particularly the black bear model, because they are tolerant of human presence and there are so many observations. It's really helping us to tease out kind of those very tenuous stepping stone patch corridors and some of the linear landscape corridors that are coming down from the higher elevations down into the valley bottom and crossing through the valley and connecting to the other side. So we are starting to pick those up. And the next step in the process is to layer in the resistance component of the model and start looking at, more from a functional connectivity modeling point of view, looking at resistance. So not shown on these maps are, the built environment and various degrees of landscape disturbance, roads and other factors that would create barriers to movement. And so we're really just looking at suitability or capability, I guess would be another way of saying it, of the habitat. And so the next stage of our work will be, using methods like least cost paths modeling to get at those networks. And so stay tuned, and really happy that you joined us here today. And stay tuned. And if you have thoughts and ideas, please do connect with us. I think we've gone through all the questions. Thanks everybody for staying a little bit later to go through those questions. Greg did have a quick question, but he'll circle back with us on that one a little bit later. And with that, I'll thank everyone again for your time. And we will be following up with next discussions and field trips that we're planning for the summer. And stay tuned. We are putting a program together for the fall, and really encourage you to give us some ideas of what you'd like to see. So with that, have an awesome day. Thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you a little bit further down the road.
Thank you, everyone.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
I think we're going to hang out for a little bit. If I'm just going to stop the recording.